announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
Before dawn, in the dark waters of the Persian Gulf, one of the most powerful warships ever built moved silently through contested seas. The USS Gerald R. Ford, a floating city armed with advanced radar systems, fighter aircraft, and enough firepower to dominate an entire region, was conducting routine operations. Or at least, that is what the official reports would later claim. What happened next would trigger alarm across command centers thousands of miles away and raise a terrifying question. How close did the world come to an open naval confrontation? According to multiple military observers and regional tracking data, unidentified high-speed vessels began appearing on long-range radar shortly after sunrise. At first, they were dismissed as civilian traffic common to the region, but within minutes, their speed and formation told a different story. These were not fishing boats. Moving fast, low to the water, and directly toward the American carrier group, the vessels matches the known tactics of Iranian Revolutionary Guard fast attack craft. Small, agile boats designed specifically to challenge much larger warships. As alarms quietly spread across the carrier strike group, escort destroyers adjusted course while surveillance aircraft scanned the horizon. Sailors moved to combat stations, weapons systems powered up. Defensive crews tracked targets that were now closing the distance at alarming speed. The massive carrier, built to project power across oceans, suddenly faced a threat measured not in size, but in unpredictability. Witness accounts suggest the boat split into multiple directions, approaching from several angles at once. A maneuver naval strategists describe as swarm tactics. At close range, even lightly armed speedboats can create chaos, forcing billion-dollar warships into split-second decisions. Radio warnings were reportedly issued. Navigation signals flashed across open channels. Yet the approaching craft continued forward, cutting across the carrier's projected path. For several tense minutes, the situation hovered on the edge of escalation. Fighter jets prepared for launch. Defensive guns tracked moving silhouettes bouncing across the waves. Every commander involved understood the stakes. One misinterpreted movement, one warning shot, one sudden maneuver could ignite an international crisis. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the boats slowed. Some altered course. Others lingered briefly within visual range before retreating back toward coastal waters. No missiles were fired. No confirmed shots exchanged. But the encounter left behind a chilling reality. Modern naval warfare no longer depends solely on massive fleets or overwhelming firepower. Sometimes, the greatest danger comes from small forces willing to test the limits of restraint. To this day, questions remain about what truly happened during those critical moments. Was it a calculated show of force? A probing maneuver meant to study American reactions? Or something far more dangerous that stopped just short of confrontation? In this video, we reconstruct the encounter step by step, examining how close the USS Gerald R. Ford may have come to its first real test under pressure, and why encounters like this continue to shape one of the most volatile regions on Earth. The encounter began in what initially appeared to be an ordinary deployment phase for the USS Gerald R. Ford, the newest and most technologically advanced aircraft carrier in the United States Navy. In late evening hours, as the carrier strike group moved through international waters near the entrance to the Persian Gulf, operations on board followed a predictable rhythm. Flight crews completed nighttime landing drills, radar operators monitored commercial shipping lanes, and escort destroyers maintained defensive formations several nautical miles ahead and behind the carrier. Officially, the mission was described as a presence operation, a strategic patrol meant to reassure regional allies and demonstrate freedom of navigation in one of the most heavily monitored maritime corridors in the world. The region itself has long been considered one of the most sensitive naval environments on Earth. The narrow waterways connecting the Gulf to global oil routes force military and civilian vessels into relatively confined paths, creating constant proximity between rival forces. American warships operating there are routinely shadowed by Iranian patrol craft, surveillance drones, and coastal radar systems. Encounters occur often enough that crews are trained to expect visual contact with Iranian vessels at almost any time. However, what unfolded that morning differed from routine observation. Shortly after sunrise, radar operators aboard one of the escorting Arleigh Burke-class destroyers detected several fast-moving surface contacts emerging from the northern sector, an area frequently used by Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval units. At first, the contacts appeared intermittently, disappearing between wave reflections and coastal interference. Within minutes, however, tracking systems confirmed at least 6 high-speed boats traveling in coordinated formation at speeds estimated above 45 knots, significantly faster than civilian traffic typical for the area. Reports later suggested that these vessels departed from a small coastal facility believed to support rapid response naval units, although neither side officially confirmed this detail. What raised immediate concern was not simply their speed, but their trajectory. Instead of maintaining parallel observation, the boats appeared to angle directly toward the projected path of the carrier strike group. Onboard intelligence teams began cross-referencing movement patterns with previous incidents recorded over the past decade, including several close approaches involving U.S. destroyers in the Strait of Hormuz. As the distance narrowed, watch officers aboard the Gerald R. Ford elevated the ship's readiness posture. While no public alarms sounded across the flight deck, internal communication channels shifted tone. Sailors assigned to defensive systems received quiet instructions to stand by, and airborne early warning aircraft already operating nearby adjusted their patrol orbit to maintain visual confirmation. According to later unofficial accounts, at least one F/A-18 fighter crew was instructed to remain cockpit-ready in case rapid launch authorization became necessary. Weather conditions added another layer of tension. Moderate swells reduced visibility at sea level, allowing smaller craft to disappear behind waves before reappearing unexpectedly at closer range. This created uncertainty about the total number of approaching boats. Some operators briefly believed additional contacts were trailing behind the initial group, suggesting a larger coordinated maneuver. Though never confirmed, internal logs reportedly noted up to 9 separate radar returns during the most confusing moments of the approach. What made the situation especially unusual was the silence. Unlike previous encounters where Iranian vessels broadcast identification signals or issued radio communications, these boats reportedly maintained radio discipline as they advanced. Their movement pattern, accelerating, separating, then regrouping, resembled swarm tactics practiced in asymmetric naval warfare exercises. For commanders responsible for protecting a vessel carrying over 4,000 personnel and dozens of aircraft, ambiguity itself became the primary threat. By the time visual observers confirmed the presence of armed speedboats on the horizon, the distance between the opposing forces had closed dramatically. What had begun as a routine transit through contested waters was rapidly transforming into a confrontation shaped by uncertainty, calculation, and the ever-present risk that a single misunderstood action could escalate beyond control. In those early moments, before warnings were issued or maneuvers began, the stage for one of the most tense naval encounters of the deployment had already been set. The first confirmed contact between the carrier strike group and the approaching vessels occurred only minutes after radar operators transitioned from passive monitoring to active tracking. Inside the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, large tactical displays began updating in rapid succession as sensor data from multiple ships merged into a single operational picture. The carrier itself relies heavily on its escorts for immediate surface defense, and it was one of the guided missile destroyers sailing ahead of the formation that first classified the incoming contacts as potentially hostile fast attack craft. Their speed, spacing, and synchronized maneuvering immediately distinguished them from commercial or fishing vessels common in the region. At approximately 20 nautical miles, automated identification systems attempted to establish standard maritime recognition through transponder signals, but no civilian identification codes were returned. This absence alone did not confirm hostile intent, yet it triggered the next level of protocol. Naval doctrine in contested waters requires layered verification before escalation, meaning crews must assume uncertainty while simultaneously preparing for worst-case scenarios. Watch officers notified the strike group commander, and within moments, readiness conditions across several ships quietly shifted upward. Sailors assigned to defensive weapons stations moved into position as remotely operated systems powered online. The escorting destroyers activated targeting radars associated with their close-in weapon systems, designed specifically to counter fast, low-profile threats such as missiles or small attack boats. On the Gerald R Ford itself, security teams sealed sensitive access points, while flight deck operations slowed, creating clear launch lanes should aircraft deployment become necessary. Despite the massive scale of the carrier, responses unfolded with practiced efficiency, the result of years of training built around exactly this type of unpredictable encounter. Visual confirmation followed shortly after. Through long-range optics, lookouts reported multiple gray-painted speedboats riding low against the water, producing narrow wake trails consistent with high-performance military craft. Some observers later claimed to have seen mounted weapons near the bows of at least 2 vessels, though glare from the morning sun made precise identification difficult. Intelligence specialists compared silhouettes against known Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval platforms, concluding that the vessels closely resembled fast inshore attack craft frequently used in Gulf patrol operations. Radio operators initiated standard bridge-to-bridge communication on internationally recognized maritime frequencies. The message was direct but measured, identifying the U.S. naval formation and requesting the approaching boats alter course to maintain safe distance. For several seconds, no response came back. The silence stretched longer than expected, increasing tension inside command centers across the strike group. According to unofficial accounts later discussed among crew members, one destroyer briefly prepared to deploy warning flares if the vessels crossed a predetermined safety boundary. At roughly 12 nautical miles, the boats accelerated again. Their formation widened, with 2 craft veering slightly south while others maintained a direct closing angle toward the carrier's projected route. This maneuver complicated tracking solutions and forced escort ships to reposition defensively. Helm commands adjusted course by only a few degrees, subtle enough to avoid provocation, but sufficient to maintain tactical advantage. Every movement at sea carries meaning, and commanders were careful not to signal panic while ensuring protection of the carrier remained absolute. Inside the Air Operations Center, pilots already assigned to patrol rotations received preliminary launch advisories. One airborne early warning aircraft descended to lower altitude to improve surface tracking, feeding real-time imagery back to the fleet. Reports suggest that electronic surveillance systems detected intermittent radar emissions from at least one approaching boat, though analysts later debated whether this originated from onboard equipment or coastal tracking stations nearby. As distance continued to shrink, tension reached a level familiar to naval crews operating in contested zones, but rarely visible to the public. Weapons were not fired, yet multiple systems were seconds away from engagement authorization. The first contact phase had transformed uncertainty into direct interaction, and both sides now operated within visual range, where intent could no longer be hidden behind radar signatures alone. Every decision from that moment forward would depend not only on technology or doctrine, but on human judgment under pressure, as 2 heavily armed forces measured each other across open water, with no guarantee of how the encounter would end. As the distance between the carrier strike group and the approaching speedboats continued to collapse, the situation entered its most dangerous phase. What had previously been a monitored approach now evolved into a complex series of maneuvers unfolding at high speed across open water. The Iranian boats no longer advanced in a predictable line. Instead, they began executing sharp directional changes, crossing wake lines and repositioning themselves around the outer defensive perimeter formed by the American escort ships. Naval analysts often describe this behavior as probing movement, a deliberate attempt to test reaction time, communication discipline, and engagement thresholds without immediately provoking a response. From the bridge of one escorting destroyer, commanders observed at least 3 boats accelerating toward the forward sector of the formation, while others drifted outward, creating the impression of partial encirclement. The tactic forced American ships to divide attention across multiple vectors simultaneously. Modern aircraft carriers are rarely alone precisely because of such threats. While the Gerald R. Ford itself possesses defensive capabilities, its protection depends on coordinated layers of escort vessels designed to intercept danger before it reaches the carrier's immediate vicinity. Now those layers were being actively challenged. The speedboats moved erratically, at times slowing almost to idle before surging forward again. Their unpredictable motion complicated targeting calculations, especially given the heavy sea reflections that interfered with optical tracking systems. One vessel reportedly cut across the projected navigation path of an American cruiser at a distance close enough to require a minor emergency adjustment in course. Though small in appearance, boats traveling at high speed carry enormous kinetic risk, and even a collision without weapons fire could have triggered escalation. Observers later noted that several of the boats appeared to operate in coordinated pairs, maintaining staggered spacing consistent with swarm engagement doctrine practiced by Iran's naval forces for decades. The principle behind such tactics is simple: overwhelm larger ships with multiple fast-moving threats that force hesitation. Large warships cannot easily maneuver at sudden angles without disrupting formation integrity, making them vulnerable to confusion rather than direct firepower. Even heavily armed vessels must carefully evaluate intent before responding, particularly in crowded international waters. As tension climbed, warning procedures intensified. Non-lethal deterrence measures were reportedly prepared, including acoustic signaling devices capable of emitting painful directional sound bursts intended to force small craft away without opening fire. Signal lamps flashed repeated navigation warnings, while escort ships increased speed slightly, generating larger wakes meant to discourage close approach. Despite these measures, at least one speedboat closed to what naval officers later described as an uncomfortably visual distance, near enough for personnel on both sides to distinguish individual crew movements. This marked the moment when the encounter approached its peak. Defensive gun mounts tracked targets continuously, their automated systems calculating firing solutions in real time. Authorization protocols required multiple confirmation steps before engagement. Yet several operators later admitted that the margin between observation and action had narrowed to seconds. Onboard intelligence channels reportedly warned commanders that similar confrontations in past decades had escalated unexpectedly due to misinterpreted maneuvers or delayed communication responses. Adding to the uncertainty, one of the approaching boats briefly altered course toward the rear sector of the formation, an area typically considered more vulnerable during transit operations. The movement prompted rapid repositioning by an escort vessel tasked with screening the carrier's stern. Though no weapons were visibly discharged, thermal sensors allegedly detected what appeared to be equipment activation consistent with mounted systems powering on. Whether this represented preparation or routine operation remains unclear. But within command networks, the possibility of hostile intent could no longer be dismissed. For several long minutes, both sides existed within a fragile balance shaped entirely by restraint. The American commanders faced a dilemma familiar to modern naval operations. Responding too aggressively risked international escalation, while hesitation could invite further encroachment. Rules of engagement emphasize proportional response, meaning force may only be used when hostile intent becomes undeniable. Determining that intent in real time, against fast-moving craft operating without clear communication, remains one of the most difficult judgments at sea. Then, gradually, subtle changes began to appear. The speedboats reduced throttle almost simultaneously, their aggressive angles softening into parallel movement alongside the strike group, rather than directly toward it. Analysts later speculated that the maneuver may have served its intended purpose, collecting visual intelligence, measuring reaction procedures, or demonstrating presence without crossing the threshold that would justify defensive fire. One vessel reportedly lingered longer than the others, pacing the formation briefly before turning away toward coastal waters. The decision not to escalate likely resulted from several overlapping factors. The overwhelming air power carried aboard the Gerald R. Ford represented a deterrent impossible to ignore. Any confirmed attack would have triggered rapid aerial response capable of neutralizing small craft within minutes. At the same time, Iranian naval doctrine historically favors calculated pressure rather than open confrontation against carrier groups, relying instead on psychological signaling and controlled risk. Both sides understood the consequences of miscalculation in a region already burdened by political tension. Environmental conditions also played a role. Increasing maritime traffic approaching nearby shipping lanes reduced maneuvering space, raising the danger that civilian vessels could become involved if confrontation erupted. Satellite monitoring from allied nations reportedly tracked the incident in real time, adding diplomatic visibility that discouraged sudden escalation. In such circumstances, restraint becomes not weakness, but strategy. Eventually, the boats turned away, one by one, accelerating back toward territorial waters. The withdrawal occurred without formal communication, leaving American crews to monitor their retreat until radar signatures faded beyond effective range. Only after confirmation of separation did readiness levels slowly return toward normal operating status. Aircraft resumed routine patterns, and formation spacing relaxed, though heightened surveillance remained in place for several hours afterward. The encounter ended without gunfire, damage, or official declaration of hostility. Yet its significance extended far beyond those quiet waters. What unfolded demonstrated how modern naval confrontations rarely resemble traditional battles. Instead, they exist within gray zones, where maneuver, perception, and restraint replace direct combat. The absence of shots fired did not diminish the seriousness of the moment. Rather, it underscored how close technologically advanced forces can come to conflict through calculated pressure alone. For the sailors involved, the episode served as a reminder that dominance at sea does not eliminate vulnerability. Massive carriers represent power on a global scale, but encounters with smaller, faster adversaries reveal the complexity of contemporary maritime strategy. The confrontation ended not because either side lacked capability, but because both ultimately chose control over escalation. A decision that, for a brief and tense stretch of time, prevented a localized encounter from becoming something far more dangerous. In the hours following the disengagement, the visible tension at sea faded, but the true consequences of the encounter began unfolding far beyond the horizon. Within the carrier strike group, commanders initiated detailed post-incident assessments, reviewing sensor recordings, communication logs, and decision timelines captured during the confrontation described earlier. Every maneuver, radar lock, and command authorization was analyzed to determine how close the situation had come to crossing the threshold from deterrence into active conflict. Naval doctrine treats such encounters as learning events, and preliminary internal evaluations reportedly concluded that reaction times across the formation had been faster than during comparable incidents recorded in previous Gulf deployments. At higher command levels, encrypted reports were transmitted to U.S. Naval Forces Central Command and the Pentagon within hours. These summaries emphasized not only the aggressive proximity of the approaching craft, but also the growing sophistication of asymmetric maritime tactics in the region. Analysts noted that while no weapons were fired, the coordination displayed suggested continued refinement of swarm-based naval strategy designed to challenge large carrier groups without initiating open warfare. Some intelligence officials privately assessed that the encounter may have functioned as a live operational test intended to observe American defensive behavior under realistic conditions. Diplomatic reactions followed cautiously. Public statements avoided escalation, describing the interaction as an unsafe and unprofessional maritime approach, language commonly used to prevent political pressure from forcing military retaliation. Behind closed doors, however, regional allies reportedly expressed concern that repeated incidents of this nature increase the probability of accidental conflict. Shipping insurers briefly adjusted regional risk evaluations after tracking data confirmed the unusual concentration of military activity near major commercial routes during the encounter. One lesser-known consequence involved electronic surveillance analysis conducted in the days afterward. Signals intelligence teams reviewing recorded emissions allegedly identified previously undocumented communication patterns between coastal monitoring stations and fast-moving surface units. Though never officially confirmed, some defense observers suggested this indicated expanded coordination networks along Iran's southern coastline. Such findings reinforced long-standing concerns that future encounters could unfold faster and with less warning than before. For the crew of the USS Gerald R. The incident marked one of the carrier's most serious real-world operational stress tests since entering active service. Training simulations often model missile threats or aerial attacks, yet close-range surface encounters demand a different form of discipline: restraint under uncertainty. Sailors later described the experience as a reminder that modern naval superiority depends as much on judgment as firepower. The carrier continued its deployment schedule shortly afterward, but additional watch rotations and surveillance patrols remained in place for several days, reflecting lingering caution. Strategically, the encounter underscored a broader reality shaping naval operations in contested waters. Neither side sought open battle, yet both demonstrated willingness to operate dangerously close to confrontation in pursuit of political signaling and strategic messaging. As mentioned earlier, the absence of combat did not signify calm relations, but rather a controlled balance maintained through calculated risk. Incidents like this rarely appear in official histories, yet they influence military planning, diplomatic negotiations, and regional stability long after ships leave the area. In the end, the waters returned to routine traffic, and official headlines moved on. But within naval command circles, the encounter remained a case study in how rapidly tension can rise between advanced military powers operating within confined maritime space. The episode served as a quiet warning that future confrontations may depend not on who possesses greater strength, but on who exercises greater restraint when seconds separate caution from irreversible escalation.